My name is Bob Durkin. I'm here in support of House Bill 5565 to end the prohibition on Kratom and implement a Kratom Consumer Protection Act. I'm an attorney, outside counsel of the American Kratom Association. I'm also a pharmacist. More importantly, for this perspective, I'm a former FDA official. I was fortunate enough to work at the United States Food and Drug Administration for 12 years, the last 6 of which I served as the Deputy Director of the Office of Dietary Supplement Programs. So I was responsible on a national level for setting enforcement policy and just policy in general for dietary supplements to include those that contain Kratom. You know, when I was at FDA back in 2015, I actually authorized the seizure of Kratom. I authorized the taking of someone's property because it was Kratom. Based on what I knew in 2015, I was correct to do that. I worked off the information that I had. What I've learned since 2015 here in 2025 that puts me in a position to come and advocate for Kratom is that the science, the understanding of Kratom and what it is has really evolved into basically a body of safety, a body of literature that the FDA really doesn't even acknowledge to this day. You know, FDA started to set its narrative for Kratom back in 2012 when some folks over in Sweden died because of taking Kratom. What's known now, and FDA knows it, is that the 8 people that died, it was because the Kratom product was contaminated with the active metabolite of the drug tramadol. And that's what did the liver damage and caused them so much problems. Back in 2015, there really wasn't a wholesome or righteous Kratom market. It was very few products were made the right way, very few were labeled the right way. Today, 10 years later, a lot of these firms, a lot of these manufacturers are registered with the Food and Drug Administration. They actually have FDA registrations. They've actually been inspected by the Food and Drug Administration. Their labels are very clear. They provide consumers with the information they need to make an informed purchase decision, information about how to take the botanical, the dietary supplement. You know, bans have the opposite effect of this. Bans push things into the black market and open up opportunities for the worst players. Where regulation allows people to follow the rules and prosper and provide your consumers with wholesome products. You know, as far as the bill is concerned here today, you know, there's some definitions that do need to be tightened up, and I do think that you need to be careful about the definition of Kratom. The definition of Kratom should include the botanical and things that are extracted from the botanical. For example, the definition of Kratom should not include something that is not found in the plant naturally. For example, a good example would be if you brewed a pot of coffee and extracted the caffeine from the coffee and then chemically turned that caffeine into something that was never in the pot of coffee and try to call that coffee. The logic just doesn't stand. You shouldn't be allowed to do that, and you shouldn't afford the protections of a KCPA if that's the product that you sell. You shouldn't be allowed to sell a product unless you have a basis to know that it's safe before you go to market. You cannot go to market and ask for time to determine whether or not your product is safe. You need to know that before you go to market. I'm aware of some other testimony on this bill and other bills like it. For example, some people saying that FDA doesn't regulate Kratom. I'm here to tell you firsthand that FDA definitely regulates Kratom. There's also been some talk that Kratom requires clinical studies before going to market. Only drugs require clinical studies before going to market, not dietary supplements. Kratom marketed as a dietary supplement can have a basis for safety, such as its long millennial history of safe use. The Federal Trade Commission does not regulate Kratom, they regulate advertising. As Dr. Smith and Mr. Haddo had said, the DEA and the FDA have evaluated whether or not Kratom should be scheduled, and it was without a doubt the Assistant Secretary for Health in 2018 rebuked FDA for shoddy science leaning towards the scheduling of Kratom and said that Kratom should never be scheduled. Last but not least are some adverse events that people talk about. Initially, FDA worked off of about 42 adverse events. When these were looked at specifically, it was determined that there were other causes. There was polydrug use, there was pre-existing conditions, and Kratom could not be seen as the causation. As a matter of fact, the causation was likely other things. There's also been some recent articles. The Tampa Bay Times published an article where they claimed there were 500 and some adverse events or deaths associated to Kratom. Those have been independently reviewed and almost completely debunked, all but maybe 7, where there are still questions about what happened with Kratom. As a former regulator, I strongly encourage you to lift the prohibition and effectively and efficiently regulate and enforce Kratom. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions?